This is the CBS Evening News. Dan Rather reporting. Good evening. The United States today made its first official contact with the Palestine Liberation Organization. The United States ambassador in Tunisia telephoned PLO headquarters and asked for a meeting. At the same time, President Reagan, Vice President Bush, and their aides were trying to accentuate the positive, including trying to assure Israel that its security is not, in their opinion, endangered by this sudden shift in U.S. policy, the decision to talk with the PLO. From Israel, Bob Simon begins our report.
U.S. Ambassador Pickering tried to calm Israeli anxieties this morning, telling Prime Minister Shamir and Foreign Minister Perez that Washington remains fully committed to Israel's security and will be carefully monitoring the PLO's behavior. But words could not change the fact that Israel's best friend and worst enemy were about to get together.
What's wrong is that the PLO, in our judgment, remains what it used to be.
If Camp David 10 years ago was a dream come true, yesterday's watershed was a rude awakening. The son of the man who made peace with Egypt said he felt bitter and betrayed.
I think it's a dead alley. I hope it will pass. Otherwise, all of us are in big trouble.
But at least one participant at Camp David thought this was equally important and equally promising.
We've been rejecting every possibility. And the no policy will have to change now. If not, then we won't have the neighboring countries around us against us. We'll have almost the whole world against us.
In the occupied territories today, there was fierce jubilation. People knew that this trajectory of international diplomacy began with their stones in Gaza 1 year ago. In Nablus, where the uprising has been ferocious, there was a new mood in those narrow streets.
We are very optimistic here that the future now is promising.
In Jerusalem, where paramilitary police have been battling Palestinians all week, leaders said the uprising is far from over.
Is this the end of the Intifada? On the contrary, this is the process of the Intifada. This is the endorsement of the political program of the Intifada. This is sort of boosting and encouraging the Intifada to continue.
Prime Minister Shamir is appealing tonight to leaders of the opposition Labour Party to join him in a broad coalition. The objective would be to prevent further erosion of Israel's position. The weapon, a peace initiative offering the Palestinians elections and some form of autonomy in the occupied territories, but not an independent state. Bob Simon, CBS News, Tel Aviv.
The administration moved quickly to answer the fears of the Israelis, beginning with a public assurance from President Reagan.
We have made it very plain that we have not retreated 1 inch from our position of guaranteeing the safety of Israel.
In another, even more blunt approach, Secretary of State Schultz summoned 7 Israeli journalists into his State Department office in what they said was a first-ever attempt at personal lobbying.
It was a real attempt from his side to convince the Israelis that he didn't betray Israel.
The administration may be committed to this new dialogue with the PLO, but that doesn't mean there's a blueprint for what exactly happens next. For one thing, with such a big potential breakthrough, the president does not want to tie the hands of the president-elect.
We will observe, we will watch. There's no game plan, there's no 5-point program.
Maybe no 5-point plan, but there is one administration priority, that the PLO stop terrorism or forget the dialogue.
Clearly, performance is still going to count. The Secretary said last night that the first item on our agenda will be terrorism.
The administration, in many ways, does not want a blueprint for the PLO dialogue. The more the U.S. makes plans with the PLO, the more the U.S. recognizes and legitimizes Yassar Arafat. And officials were clearly straining today not to be remembered for doing that.
Recognition in no way enters into this equation.
Experts say it's already too late.
The U.S. is engaged in a dialogue with the PLO, which essentially, for all intents and purposes, makes the PLO the Arab negotiating partner.
Like it or not, the experts say, the U.S. has just given Yassar Arafat a more respectable worldwide image and has helped his claim to be a peacemaker. Part of the reason Israel stays so upset is that Ronald Reagan now has a stake in Arafat's success. Wyatt Andrews, CBS News, the State Department.
This evening, I talked by satellite with King Hussein of Jordan, a man whom U.S. leaders have always seen as a key figure in the Middle East peace process. The King told me the U.S. contact with the PLO clears the way for real progress toward peace, and he said it could come as early as next spring.
I am extremely happy, sir, and extremely encouraged and hopeful that this is a turning point towards resolving the most volatile problem threatening regional peace in this area and certainly world peace.
In your opinion, what is the single most important thing for Americans to understand about what's happened in the last 24 to 48 hours?
I believe that they should understand that the Palestinians and their representatives have opted for peace and showed their readiness to contribute their utmost for the attainment of a permanent, lasting peace in this area based on justice.
Secretary Shultz and President Reagan, particularly President Reagan, placed heavy emphasis on Yassar Arafat renouncing terrorism. Question, can Arafat deliver on that promise? It's one thing to say we renounce terrorism. It's another to keep terrorist acts from happening. Can he deliver on that?
I believe neither the Israelis, nor the Palestinians, nor anyone in this world can absolutely guarantee that no extremists from whichever side might try to damage what has been achieved or destroy the chances for progress towards peace. But I know Arafat to be a man who's determined to stand by his word to the best of his ability, and that's good enough for me.
Many Arabs and some Jews in the United States support the Reagan-Bush administration's change of policy toward the PLO. But some on both sides were still wary. With that part of the story, CBS News correspondent Richard Schlesinger. Richard?
Dan, today spokesmen for major Jewish organizations are still issuing demands to Arafat. They are demanding proof. Proof the PLO wants peace, proof it can live with Israel. Schultz's decision was greeted cautiously.
It will not send us closer towards peace unless these words of Arafat, these weasel words, these squeezed words, these reluctant words, are matched by actual deeds on the ground.
I think it will serve peace because it will put Mr. Arafat's feet to the fire. So this is an opportunity to test Mr. Arafat. And if, in fact, he meets that test, then he can become a partner to peace.
Most Jewish leaders believe the old Arafat still lurks behind his new and improved image. But it is that image, some believe, that forced the U.S. to open talks.
It confirms that Israel has taken a bashing in the public relations campaign that Arafat has waged so successfully.
There is an equal amount of skepticism in some parts of the Arab American community. Some are asking, what is on Washington's agenda?
Palestinians are concerned because, I mean, the United States has a long record of abusing Palestinians and supporting Israel in oppressing Palestinians.
Still, the reaction among Arab Americans to the Schultz move is largely positive, in some cases exuberant.
I mean, we're so close to peace, I feel I can touch it.
In 1979, Andrew Young was fired from his job as ambassador to the UN when he met with representatives of the PLO. Today, Young believes times have changed.
What this is that the mainstream of public policy, of international policy, is moving in the direction toward peace through dialogue.
And times have also changed for Rita Hauser, who just 9 days ago was vilified for being part of a meeting between Arafat and American Jews.
Whether you like Mr. Arafat or you don't like Mr. Arafat, he is the head of the PLO, and the Palestinians have said it over and over, the PLO is their leader.
Well, Dan, nobody is willing to say how much times have changed. Jewish leaders say that depends on how much Arafat has changed, and Arab leaders believe true change in the Mideast depends on Israel's next move.
Richard Schlesinger, thanks. In Geneva today, the UN General Assembly voted to call for an international peace conference on the Middle East and to place the Israeli-occupied Arab lands under UN supervision. The vote, 138-2, the United States joined Israel in voting no. Still to come on tonight's CBS Evening News, Bill Plant and Doug Tennell trace the negotiations that led to Arafat's so-called magic words. And Tom Fenton traces the curious course of Arafat's life on the run. the United States would begin talking directly with the Palestine Liberation Organization followed an intense round of negotiations in which the two sides talked to each other through intermediaries. CBS News correspondents Bill Plant in Washington and Doug Tennell in Geneva have prepared a chronology of how the deal was done.
First word that PLO leader Yassar Arafat was ready to talk, despite the fact that the U.S. had refused him a visa, came 2 weeks ago in a message from Sweden. It asked the administration what language, what words it would take from Arafat to meet the U.S. conditions. The response from Washington the next day, immediate, a clear indication that the administration wanted action after years of frustration in the Middle East.
Yassar Arafat and his senior advisors were in Stockholm, Sweden on the 6th of December with a counter-proposal for the so-called magic words the chairman of the PLO would have to say in order to open a dialogue with the U.S. government. The PLO's text hit all three key points, but it was fuzzy on the recognition of Israel's right to exist and on renouncing terrorism. The Swedes sent the text to Washington anyway. December 7th, Arafat approved of, but he did not sign a joint statement on PLO aims with a group of visiting American Jews in Stockholm.
There's still a considerable distance to go.
2 days after expressing public dissatisfaction with Arafat's first statement in Sweden, the U.S. received from the Swedes proposed language for the PLO leader's speech to the UN General Assembly. On Monday, December 12th, the U.S. sent another written response outlining exactly what the PLO leader had to say in his UN speech to trigger an immediate dialogue. Israel was notified the same day.
Yassar Arafat enters the assembly hall at UN headquarters in Geneva with an almost triumphant smile. It is an extraordinary tightrope act. Hardliners in the PLO could break ranks with Arafat's mainstream if he goes too far. The magic words are sprinkled throughout the lengthy, flowery speech. And in the end, his closest advisors say Arafat is convinced he has pulled it off, held the radicals, and satisfied the American demands.
From Washington, an almost immediate reaction. Arafat's speech hadn't gone far enough.
To the extent people expected that it would come face-to-face with the conditions needed for a U.S. PLO dialogue, it didn't do that.
At the same time, President-elect Bush was sending another message. Keep trying.
The conditions are clear. American position is very clear, and I would welcome any progress, but it's got to be clear.
December 14th, Arab moderates, the Saudis and Egyptians, tell both sides not to give up. Arafat postpones a morning press conference to meet instead with the Swedish diplomats who have brokered the deal. Once again, they are hammering away at words. Then, late in the day in Geneva, Arafat meets the press and restates the PLO's positions publicly, succinctly.
We totally and absolutely renounce all forms of terrorism.
Afterwards, Arafat appears relieved, almost lighthearted, perhaps having sensed that this time the chairman of the PLO had finally achieved a breakthrough.
Enough is enough.
At the State Department, analysts spent the early afternoon poring over the new Arafat statement. By 4 o'clock, the Secretary of State was satisfied. He called National Security Advisor Colin Powell to say that the PLO language now appeared to meet U.S. conditions for a dialogue. Powell first briefed the Vice President, then the President. And at 5:12 yesterday afternoon, Mr. Reagan made his decision and told George Shultz to announce it.
The United States is prepared for a substantive dialogue with PLO representatives.
And in fact, administration sources are saying that it was George Shultz, his time as Secretary of State now running out, who was indeed the driving force behind all of this. Dan?
Bill and Doug Tennell, is this seen as a big, major breakthrough?
Dan, for the PLO officials I saw around Geneva today, there was very little jubilation. All of them were saying this is just a first step. Some of them even said it isn't nearly enough. We've got to continue. They all seem to realize how narrow this opening is, how limited these contacts are, at least at this stage, and none of them have any great hopes, although they are somewhat hopeful it'll lead to something bigger and broader.
Dan, administration officials are very anxious to regard this as only a beginning. It's a breakthrough, yes, but just the beginning of talks. They emphasize here that they are not recognizing a Palestinian state. They are not negotiating with the PLO. They've just begun to talk. Dan?
Bill and Doug Tennell, thank you. An American relief team was getting ready to return from Soviet Armenia today as hopes faded for any more earthquake survivors. The U.S. team rescued several people when it first arrived, but gave up hope after temperatures dropped below freezing this week. The death toll is still estimated officially at 55,000 dead, with 500,000 homeless. Thousands of women and children have been evacuated, and Soviet authorities are now asking everyone to leave the worst-hit areas. They're preparing to bulldoze the ruins and then, they say, rebuild the Armenian cities starting in the spring. Elect George Bush today announced new restrictions on White House reporters. No more questions allowed at White House photo opportunities after he takes office. CBS News National Affairs correspondent Leslie Stahl reports this comes amid increasing indications that Mr. Bush is so angry over published reports leaking word of his cabinet appointments that he reportedly may have canceled the official announcement of one today.
George Bush continues to be incensed over news leaks, so obsessed, say his aides, that he has been inclined to change plans and become more secretive because of them. In fact, just this morning, say the sources, a story in the Washington Post that Mr. Bush was about to name 2 blacks to his cabinet infuriated him to the point where he said in anger that he wouldn't make any cabinet announcements today at all, even though Chicago transit official Samuel Skinner had been informed that he would be named Transportation Secretary today. But the Post story surfaced yesterday not through a leak, but at a public briefing by his chief of staff.
We're not having difficulty finding qualified black candidates for these positions, and we are evaluating and looking at more than one or two, in fact.
In the story, longtime Bush friend Dr. Louis Sullivan was described as the leading candidate for Health and Human Services. Retired General Julius Becton, top contender for the Veterans Administration. Mr. Bush was asked about it today.
Don't believe all the rumors that float around. Just wait to have an announcement.
Transition sources say Mr. Bush has expressed his rage over news leaks for years, and that's why he asked his transition team to sign a no-leaks secrecy pledge. Some Bush aides say they worry because past presidents who became obsessed with leaks got themselves into trouble, including President Reagan, who wanted to give even his Secretary of State a lie detector test. Leslie Stahl, CBS News, Washington.
What about today's leak that Jack Kemp is going to be the new Secretary of Housing and Urban Development? Nobody will say. Familiar scene, final time. President Reagan and First Lady Nancy Reagan stepped out on the White House portico this evening for the switching on of the national Christmas tree, the last tree lighting ceremony of the Reagan presidency.
I can't get out of bed.
Confident that if we can have a fair trial and due process, we will win this case.
U.S. Magistrate Paul Taylor lifted Bakker's passport, restricted travel to North and South Carolina, and set bond at $50,000. Jim and Tammy Bakker are back to making public appearances, signing Bibles for loyal followers. They have rented a skating rink to hold weekly church services, usually attracting about 300 people.
All of us working together have been able to do something on a shoestring.
But the Bakkers are apparently not living on a shoestring. They are staying in this huge North Carolina mansion and are making plans to return to television. Bakker is not the only evangelist having trouble with the government. The Internal Revenue Service has ordered audits at Jerry Falwell's Liberty University, Pat Robertson's CBN Network, and Oral Roberts Ministries. Bakker is expected to go to trial in June or July, and his attorney says the case could take up to 6 months. Bruce Hall, CBS News, Charlotte.
You think of it, approve or disapprove, the United States' decision to talk with the Palestine Liberation Organization came as a triumph for a one-of-a-kind politician, a world figure now who has no country, not even a fixed address, and who more than once has looked to be on the verge of extinction. Tom Fenton profiles the leader of the PLO.
Yassar Arafat spent his first day in his new role as a U.S. inspected and approved statesman visiting Communist Party leader Erich Honecker in East Germany. It has taken Arafat more than 30 years to complete the transformation from terrorist leader to world statesman. In fact, this genial little man with the paunch and the 3-day beard has never looked either part. For much of the West and his enemies, he symbolizes hijacking, bombing, and murder. But to 6 million Palestinians, he is George Washington.
Our roots is very deep, deep in this land.
Like many revolutionaries, Arafat says little about his past. This non-smoking, non-drinking bachelor was born in Cairo or Jerusalem or Gaza, depending on what you read. But he is close to 60 and once owned construction companies in Kuwait that made him independently wealthy. Arafat is the ultimate survivor. In the 1960s, he emerged on the Middle East scene in one of the world's most dangerous roles, professional enemy of Israel. As leader of al-Fatah commandos and later chairman of the PLO, Arafat has succeeded in staying alive by never sleeping twice in the same bed and always knowing when to leave town. King Hussein kicked him and his guerrillas out of Jordan in 1970. He has twice been driven out of Lebanon by a combination of Israel, Syria, and Palestinian brothers. But he always pops back up again, claiming moral victory. As a politician, he stays on top of one of the world's most unstable organizations by juggling interests and playing to the crowd. His ability to come down firmly on all sides of an issue got him to Geneva this week and then made him almost blow it. As a statesman, Arafat is entering the most hazardous phase of his career. The once unwelcome revolutionary who has survived by dodging assassination may find it much more difficult to dodge the issues now that he is suddenly respectable. Tom Fenton, CBS News, Geneva.
And that's tonight's CBS Evening News. Dan Rather, we hope you'll stay tuned for the program 48 Hours. Tonight, 48 Hours Inside the Vatican. That's coming up right here at 7 Central Time. See you then.
Inside the Vatican, the private world of a public pope, a world of secrets and miracles. 48 Hours tonight.
This is CBS.